The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty town of Copper Ridge as Jacob Mason rode his weathered horse through the main street. His dark eyes scanned the wooden buildings and the few people who dared venture outside in the afternoon heat. Jacob had been drifting through the desert territories for 3 years now. Ever since the war ended and left him with nothing but memories he wished he could forget, his horse needed water, and Jacob needed supplies before continuing his journey to nowhere in particular. The town seemed quiet enough, though something felt off. The usual sounds of frontier life were missing. No children playing in the streets, no women hanging laundry, no men discussing business outside the general store. Even the saloon looked nearly empty. Jacob tied his horse to the post outside Murphy's General Store and pushed through the creaky door. The bell above jangled, and the elderly storekeeper looked up with nervous eyes. "Afternoon, stranger," the man said, his voice shaky. "You best not stay long in these parts. Why's that?" Jacob asked, selecting some dried beef and hardtack from the shelves. He noticed the man's hands trembling as he wrapped the goods. "There's been trouble with the Apache lately," Murphy whispered, glancing toward the window. "At least that's what Sheriff Hawkins says." 3 Apache women were caught stealing cattle from the Morrison ranch. "They're set to hang tomorrow morning?" Jacob's jaw tightened. Something about this didn't sit right with him. In his years of traveling through Apache territory, he'd learned to respect their ways. Apache women rarely engaged in cattle rustling, especially not in broad daylight where they'd easily be caught. "Where are they being held?" "The old jail behind the courthouse." "But mister, I wouldn't go poking around if I were you. Sheriff Hawkins doesn't take kindly to outsiders asking questions." Jacob paid for his supplies and left the store, his mind racing. The town's fear was palpable, but it felt different from the usual tension between settlers and Native Americans. This felt more like guilt and secrecy. He decided to take a walk around town, keeping his eyes and ears open. As evening approached, Jacob made his way to the small boarding house on the edge of town. The elderly woman who ran it, Mrs. Chun, was one of the few people who seemed willing to talk openly. Over a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, she shared what she knew. "Those Apache women," she said quietly, "they were found on Morrison's land, but they weren't stealing cattle. They were gathering herbs for medicine. I saw one of them in town just last week, trading beadwork for flour. Sweet girl, couldn't have been more than 16. And then why are they being charged with rustling?" Mrs. Chen glanced around nervously before continuing. "Morrison's been having trouble with missing cattle, that's true. But I think he's looking for someone to blame rather than finding the real thieves. And Sheriff Hawkins, well, he's been mighty friendly with Morrison lately. Word is Morrison's promised him a nice piece of land if he can solve this cattle problem quickly." Jacob felt his blood boil. He'd seen this kind of frontier justice before, where innocent people became scapegoats for crimes they didn't commit. The Apache women were easy targets, outsiders with no one to speak for them in a town controlled by men like Morrison and Hawkins. That night, Jacob couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the 3 women sitting in that jail, probably terrified and knowing they were going to die for something they didn't do. He'd spent years running from his past, avoiding getting involved in other people's problems. But something about this situation reminded him of why he'd fought in the war in the first place. To protect the innocent from those who would abuse their power. Around midnight, Jacob quietly saddled his horse and rode toward the courthouse. The jail was a small, sturdy building made of adobe and wood, with thick iron bars on the single window. A lone guard sat outside, but he was fast asleep, an empty bottle beside his chair. Jacob approached the window carefully. Inside, he could see 3 figures huddled together in the single cell. When he whispered softly in the few Apache words he knew, one of them looked up. She was young, maybe 17, with intelligent dark eyes filled with fear but also defiance. "English?" Jacob asked quietly. She nodded. "A little." "You help?" "I'm going to try." "What really happened at the Morrison ranch?" The young woman explained haltingly that they had been gathering willow bark for her sick grandmother when Morrison's men found them. They had been nowhere near the cattle, but the men accused them anyway. When they tried to explain, no one would listen. Jacob's suspicions were confirmed. These women were innocent, but in a few hours they would hang unless he did something about it. He told them to be ready and that he would return before dawn, riding back to the boarding house. Jacob's mind was already forming a plan. He couldn't break them out by force, not without proof of their innocence and Morrison's corruption. But he'd learned a few things about reading people and situations during his years of drifting. If Morrison was really behind false accusations, there had to be evidence somewhere. The real cattle thieves were probably still operating, and Jacob had a feeling that Morrison knew exactly who they were. Perhaps Morrison was even involved himself, using the Apache women as a convenient cover for his own crimes. Jacob had until dawn to find the truth and save 3 innocent lives. Jacob spent the remaining hours before dawn investigating the real cattle thefts. He rode out to Morrison's ranch under cover of darkness, studying the tracks and signs that told the true story of what had been happening. The evidence he found made his blood run cold. The missing cattle hadn't been driven away by Apache raiders at all. Instead, they had been systematically moved to a hidden canyon about 5 miles north of the ranch. Jacob found the concealed trail that led to a natural corral where nearly 50 head of Morrison's own cattle were being held, but this wasn't just simple cattle rustling. As Jacob watched from the rocks above, he saw Morrison himself arrive with 2 of his ranch hands. They were rebranding the cattle, changing Morrison's distinctive double M brand into something entirely different. Jacob realized this was an insurance scheme. Morrison was reporting his cattle as stolen, claiming compensation, and then rebranding them to sell elsewhere. "Get those last 20 ready for the drive to Phoenix," Morrison told his men. "By the time those Apache squaws hang tomorrow, this whole business will be forgotten. Sheriff Hawkins will have his land, and I'll have enough money to buy out half the territory." Jacob had heard enough. Morrison wasn't just framing innocent women. He was orchestrating an elaborate fraud that would make him rich while 3 people died for crimes they never committed. But getting proof that would stand up in court was another matter entirely. As Morrison and his men worked, Jacob carefully made his way down to the hidden corral. Using skills he'd learned during his army days, he managed to get close enough to see the rebranding operation clearly. He also noticed something else that made the conspiracy even more sinister. One of Morrison's men was actually Deputy Collins, Sheriff Hawkins' right-hand man. The whole law enforcement structure of Copper Ridge was involved in the scheme. Jacob realized that simply presenting evidence to Sheriff Hawkins would be useless. Since Hawkins was already bought and paid for, he needed to find another way to expose the truth and save the Apache women. Jacob retreated to plan his next move. Dawn was still 3 hours away, but he needed to act fast. The hanging was scheduled for sunrise, and once those women were dead, Morrison's secret would be buried with them. The town would move on, and the real criminals would never face justice. He decided on a bold plan that would require perfect timing and a lot of luck. First, he needed to gather more evidence that couldn't be disputed. Second, he needed to find someone in authority who wasn't part of Morrison's conspiracy. Third, he had to make sure the Apache women lived long enough for the truth to come out. Jacob rode hard back toward town. But instead of going to the courthouse, he headed for the telegraph office. The operator was asleep, but Jacob woke him up and paid him extra to send an urgent message to the territorial marshal in Phoenix. The message detailed Morrison's cattle fraud and requested immediate investigation. Next, Jacob visited Dr. Harrison, the town's physician, who lived in a small house behind his office. Dr. Harrison was one of the few people in town who had spoken against the hasty trial of the Apache women. Jacob woke the doctor and quickly explained what he'd discovered. "I knew something wasn't right about this whole business," Dr. Harrison said, pulling on his clothes. "Those women showed no signs of guilt when I examined them for injuries after their arrest. They were genuinely confused and frightened, not defiant like real cattle thieves would be. Will you help me?" Jacob asked. "Tell me what you need." Jacob outlined his plan. Dr. Harrison would go to the jail and claim that one of the Apache women was seriously ill and needed immediate medical attention. This would delay the hanging and give Jacob time to expose Morrison's operation. Meanwhile, Jacob would ride back to the hidden canyon and bring back physical evidence of the fraud. As the first hints of dawn appeared on the horizon, Dr. Harrison hurried to the courthouse while Jacob galloped back toward Morrison's secret operation. Time was running short, and Jacob knew that if his plan failed, 3 innocent women would die and a group of criminals would continue their operations with impunity. When Jacob reached the canyon again, he found it empty except for the cattle. Morrison and his men had finished their work and left, probably confident that by the time the sun was fully up, their troubles would be over. Jacob quickly gathered evidence, including pieces of the old brands that had been burned off, and samples of the new branding irons that had been carelessly left behind. He also freed several of the cattle, driving them back toward the main trail where they would be easily found by anyone who came looking. The cattle themselves were proof of Morrison's deception, since they were supposedly stolen but were actually just hidden away. As Jacob raced back toward town with his evidence, he could see smoke rising from the courthouse area. His heart sank, thinking he might be too late. But as he got closer, he realized the smoke was coming from a small fire that Dr. Harrison had built to sterilize his medical instruments. The doctor's plan had worked, and the hanging had been postponed. Jacob arrived at the courthouse just as Sheriff Hawkins was arguing with Dr. Harrison about the delay. "This is ridiculous, Doc. One sick Indian isn't worth delaying justice for." "Sheriff," Jacob called out, riding up with a saddlebag full of evidence, "I think you'll want to see what I found before you hang anyone." The crowd that had gathered for the execution turned to look at the dusty stranger who had interrupted their morning entertainment. Jacob dismounted and pulled out the branding irons and burned brand pieces, holding them up for everyone to see. "Morrison's been playing you all for fools," Jacob announced loudly enough for the whole crowd to hear. "Those women didn't steal any cattle. Morrison's been stealing from himself, hiding the cattle, and planning to rebrand them for sale. He needed someone to blame, so he framed 3 innocent women." Sheriff Hawkins' face went white, but he tried to bluster his way through. "That's impossible. We caught those women red-handed on Morrison's land." "Yeah, gathering medicine herbs," Jacob shot back, while Morrison's real operation was happening 5 miles away. The crowd around the courthouse began murmuring as Jacob displayed the evidence. People who had been eager to watch a hanging suddenly seemed uncertain. Mrs. Chun pushed forward from the crowd, her face determined. "I told you those girls were innocent," she declared loudly. "Anyone with eyes could see they weren't cattle thieves." Sheriff Hawkins tried to regain control of the situation. "Now hold on, everyone. This drifter shows up with some old iron and claims it proves something. How do we know he didn't plant this evidence himself?" Jacob had expected this reaction. "Because Morrison's cattle are still in the hidden canyon, Sheriff. About 50 head of them, all rebranded and ready for sale. I can take you there right now. And I can verify that one of these women was in my store just last week, trading honest goods for supplies," added Murphy, the storekeeper. "She didn't look like any cattle thief to me." Dr. Harrison stepped forward. "I've examined these women thoroughly. They show no signs of riding hard or handling cattle. Their hands are soft from beadwork, not rough from rustling. They're innocent, Sheriff." The crowd was now clearly on the side of the Apache women. Jacob could see Sheriff Hawkins sweating, trying to figure out how to handle the situation without exposing his own involvement in Morrison's scheme. "Where's Morrison?" Jacob asked loudly. "Shouldn't he be here to see justice done to the people who supposedly stole his cattle?" "Mr. Morrison had business in Phoenix," Hawkins replied quickly. "He left yesterday evening." "Convenient timing," Jacob said. "Leaves town just before the hanging, just before anyone might ask him uncomfortable questions about his missing cattle." At that moment, Deputy Collins came running up to Sheriff Hawkins, his face pale with worry. He whispered something urgently in the sheriff's ear, and Hawkins' expression grew even more troubled. Jacob had a good idea what the deputy was reporting. The cattle Jacob had freed from the canyon had probably wandered back onto Morrison's main property, where ranch hands would have found them. It would be hard to explain how stolen cattle had managed to find their way home on their own. "Sheriff," Dr. Harrison said formally, I'm requesting a postponement of this execution pending a full investigation. These women deserve a fair trial, not a rushed judgment. Several people in the crowd voiced their agreement. Jacob could see that public opinion had shifted dramatically. The people of Copper Ridge were beginning to realize they had been manipulated into supporting the execution of innocent women. "There's something else you should know," Jacob announced. "I sent a telegraph to the territorial marshal in Phoenix this morning. He's probably already on his way to investigate Morrison's cattle operation." Sheriff Hawkins looked like a trapped animal. Deputy Collins was fidgeting nervously, clearly wanting to say something, but not daring to speak up in front of the crowd. Mrs. Chun stepped closer to Jacob. "How did you know to investigate this?" she asked quietly. "I've seen this kind of thing before," Jacob replied. "During the war and in other towns I've passed through. When someone's real eager to blame outsiders for local problems, it usually means they're trying to hide something." The sheriff made one last attempt to maintain control. "Even if Morrison's involved in something dishonest, it doesn't prove these Apache women are innocent. They were still found on his property without permission." "Gathering medicine herbs?" Jacob repeated. "On land that's been used by Apache people for generations. They weren't stealing anything, and you know it." Dr. Harrison unlocked the jail cell and began examining the three Apache women more thoroughly. The youngest one, who had spoken to Jacob the night before, looked at him with gratitude and hope in her eyes. "My grandmother very sick," she told Dr. Harrison in her limited English. "We need willow bark for medicine. Always gather there, many seasons." "And Morrison knew that," Jacob added. "He knew they came there regularly, which made them perfect scapegoats when he needed someone to blame for his fake cattle thefts." The crowd was now completely convinced of the women's innocence. Several people began demanding that Sheriff Hawkins release them immediately. Others wanted to know where Morrison had really gone and when he would be brought back to face charges. Jacob pulled Sheriff Hawkins aside. "You've got a choice to make, Sheriff. You can keep pretending these women are guilty and hope the territorial marshal doesn't find Morrison's operation. Or you can cooperate with the investigation and maybe save yourself from going down with Morrison." Hawkins wiped sweat from his forehead. "I don't know what you're talking about. Your deputy was at the Hidden Canyon last night, helping Morrison rebrand the cattle. I saw him myself. When the marshal gets here, he's going to find evidence of the whole operation. You can either be part of the solution or part of the problem." Deputy Collins, overhearing this conversation, suddenly stepped forward. "Sheriff, I need to tell you something important." Hawkins glared at his deputy, but Collins continued anyway. "Morrison offered me money to help with moving some cattle. He said it was legal business, but now I'm thinking maybe it wasn't." "You fool," Hawkins hissed. "Keep your mouth shut." But it was too late. The crowd had heard enough to understand that both the sheriff and his deputy were involved in Morrison's scheme. Dr. Harrison stood up from examining the Apache women and announced loudly, "These women are completely innocent. They should be released immediately and given an apology from this town." Jacob felt a sense of satisfaction as he watched the tide turn completely in favor of justice. The Apache women would live, Morrison's conspiracy was exposed, and the corrupt law enforcement officials would face consequences for their actions, but he also knew this was just the beginning. Morrison was still free, probably trying to cover his tracks or escape entirely. The territorial marshal would need solid evidence to build a case, and there were still plenty of ways this could go wrong. By mid-morning, the territorial marshal arrived from Phoenix with 2 deputies. Marshal Thompson was a stern man in his 50s who had seen enough frontier corruption to recognize it immediately. Jacob met him at the edge of town and quickly explained the situation. "So we've got cattle fraud, false imprisonment, and conspiracy to commit murder?" Thompson summarized grimly. "And the main perpetrator has fled?" "Morrison left for Phoenix yesterday evening, according to the sheriff," Jacob confirmed. "But I have a feeling he didn't go to Phoenix at all." Thompson nodded. Smart thinking. A man running a con like this would have an escape plan ready. He studied Jacob carefully. "You're not from around here. What made you get involved in this mess?" Wrong place, right time, Jacob replied simply. Sometimes you can't walk away from injustice, even when you'd rather mind your own business. The marshal and his men examined the evidence Jacob had collected and interviewed the Apache women with the help of a translator they had brought. The women's story was consistent and clearly true. They had been gathering medicinal plants when Morrison's men found them, and immediately accused them of stealing cattle. Meanwhile, the investigation at Morrison's ranch revealed even more damning evidence. The hidden canyon contained not just Morrison's cattle, but also animals belonging to other ranchers in the area. Morrison had been stealing cattle from multiple sources, rebranding them, and selling them while claiming they were stolen from him for insurance purposes. This operation's been going on for at least 6 months. Deputy Marshal Williams reported after examining the canyon thoroughly. There's evidence of multiple rebranding operations and several different sets of altered brands. Sheriff Hawkins and Deputy Collins were arrested and placed in their own jail cells. Under questioning, Collins broke down and admitted his involvement, hoping for leniency. He revealed that Morrison had promised him a share of the profits and had convinced him that they were just recovering stolen cattle, not stealing them themselves. Morrison told me the Apache were stealing cattle all over the territory, Collins confessed. He said we were just getting back what was rightfully ours. I didn't know he was planning to frame those women for murder. The Apache women were released with formal apologies from the town. The youngest one, whose name was Ayana, approached Jacob before they departed. "You save our lives," she said in her careful English. "Our people will remember. You always welcome in our territory?" Jacob felt a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. For too long, he had been running from his past and avoiding connections with other people. Helping these women had reminded him that there was still good he could do in the world, but Morrison was still free, and Jacob suspected the man hadn't gone far. A criminal as calculating as Morrison wouldn't just run blindly into the desert. He would have a specific plan and destination in mind. Jacob shared his suspicions with Marshal Thompson. Morrison knows this territory well. He's probably got friends or business partners who don't know about his illegal activities. He might try to lay low until he thinks it's safe to resurface. Any idea where he might go? There's a trading post about 30 miles south of here, near the Mexican border. If Morrison's planning to disappear into Mexico, he'd need to resupply there first. Thompson considered this. It's worth checking. Will you guide us there? Jacob hesitated. He had done his good deed and saved the Apache women. He could easily ride away now and continue his wandering life. But something about this case felt unfinished. Morrison needed to face justice, not just for the sake of the 3 women he had tried to murder, but for all the other people he might victimize in the future. "I'll take you there," Jacob agreed. The ride to the trading post took most of the day. Along the way, Marshal Thompson shared more details about Morrison's background. The man had been involved in several questionable business deals across the territory, but had always managed to stay just on the legal side of things. This cattle fraud scheme was his most ambitious and dangerous venture yet. "Men like Morrison think they're smarter than everyone else," Thompson explained. "They get overconfident and start taking bigger risks. Eventually, they make a mistake that brings them down." As they approached the trading post, Jacob spotted smoke from the chimney and several horses tied outside. The building was a rough wooden structure that served as store, saloon, and inn for travelers heading to or from Mexico. "That's Morrison's horse," Jacob said quietly, pointing to a distinctive black stallion with white markings. "He's definitely here." Thompson and his deputies surrounded the building while Jacob entered through the front door. The trading post was dimly lit and filled with the usual assortment of frontier characters, travelers, traders, and men who preferred not to discuss their business openly. Morrison was sitting at a corner table, apparently negotiating with a Mexican trader about something. He looked up as Jacob entered, and his face went pale with recognition. "You," Morrison said, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. "I should have known you'd be trouble the moment you rode into town." "It's over, Morrison," Jacob said calmly. "The marshal's outside with warrants for your arrest." Your cattle fraud scheme is exposed, and those Apache women you tried to murder are free. Morrison's hand froze on his gun as he realized he was trapped. The other patrons of the trading post began moving away from the table, sensing trouble. You don't understand, Morrison said desperately. I was trying to save that town. The Apache raids were destroying our economy. Someone had to take action. By framing innocent women for crimes they didn't commit? They weren't innocent. No Apache is innocent in this territory? Jacob felt his anger rising at Morrison's racist justification for his crimes. You weren't protecting anyone. You were stealing cattle and getting rich while blaming it on people who had nothing to do with your schemes. At that moment, Marshal Thompson entered with his deputies, guns drawn. William Morrison, you're under arrest for cattle theft, fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder. Morrison made a desperate grab for his gun, but Jacob was faster. Years of frontier living had kept his reflexes sharp, and he knocked Morrison's weapon away before the man could draw it properly. Morrison was shackled and loaded onto a horse for the ride back to Copper Ridge. During the journey, he alternated between angry threats and desperate attempts to negotiate his way out of trouble. Marshal Thompson ignored all of Morrison's pleas and focused on building the strongest possible case against him. You know what bothers me most about men like you? Thompson told Morrison during one of his rants. You had everything a man could want in this territory. Good land, successful ranch, respect in the community. But it wasn't enough. You had to scheme and steal and destroy innocent lives just to get a little more. Morrison's response revealed the depth of his corruption. Respect doesn't pay the bills, Marshal. This territory's changing, and men who don't adapt get left behind. I was just thinking ahead, planning for the future. By murdering 3 innocent women? They weren't murders. They were necessities. Sometimes you have to sacrifice a few to protect the many. Jacob listened to this conversation with growing disgust. Morrison showed no remorse for his crimes and no understanding of the lives he had nearly destroyed. The man was completely convinced that his actions were justified. When they reached Copper Ridge, a crowd had gathered to see Morrison brought to justice. The Apache women were there too, having delayed their departure to see the man who had nearly killed them face the consequences of his actions. Dr. Harrison had spent the day treating the women for the injuries and trauma they had suffered during their imprisonment. They're remarkably resilient, he told Jacob, but this experience will stay with them for the rest of their lives. The formal charges against Morrison were extensive. In addition to the cattle theft and fraud, he faced charges of conspiracy, perjury, bribery of public officials, and 3 counts of attempted murder. The evidence was overwhelming, and Morrison's own arrogance had provided the prosecution with plenty of material. Sheriff Hawkins and Deputy Collins would also face trial, though their cooperation with the investigation might earn them reduced sentences. The town of Copper Ridge would need new law enforcement, and Marshal Thompson had already begun the process of finding suitable replacements. What about you? Thompson asked Jacob as they finished the paperwork. You interested in staying on as sheriff? This town could use someone with your integrity and investigative skills. Jacob considered the offer seriously. Part of him was tempted by the chance to build a stable life and continue fighting for justice. But another part of him wasn't ready to settle down yet. The wandering life had become too much a part of who he was. I appreciate the offer, Marshal, but I'm not ready to put down roots just yet. This town will do fine with someone who actually wants to be here permanently. Thompson nodded understanding. I figured you might say that. But if you ever change your mind, there's always a place for good men in law enforcement. The trial would take place in a few weeks, but the outcome was never in doubt. Morrison's crimes were too well documented and his victims too sympathetic for any jury to find him innocent. He would spend many years in territorial prison, and his ranch would be sold to compensate his victims. As Jacob prepared to leave Copper Ridge, several townspeople approached him to express their gratitude. Mrs. Chun insisted on packing him extra supplies for his journey. Dr. Harrison gave him a letter of recommendation in case he ever needed to prove his character in another town, you saved more than just 3 lives. Dr. Harrison told him. You saved this whole town's soul. We were about to let innocent people die because it was convenient and easy. You showed us that doing the right thing is worth the effort. The Apache women had already departed for their tribal lands, but they had left a gift for Jacob with Dr. Harrison. It was a small medicine pouch decorated with intricate beadwork, along with a message that Ayana had asked the doctor to translate. She says this will bring you protection and good fortune on your travels, Dr. Harrison explained. She also says that you will always be considered a friend of her people, and that any Apache you meet will help you if you show them this pouch. Jacob was deeply moved by the gift. In his years of drifting, he had rarely formed meaningful connections with the people he met. But this experience had reminded him of the satisfaction that came from fighting for justice and protecting the innocent Dot as he rode out of Copper Ridge the next morning. Jacob reflected on how much his life had changed in just a few days. He had arrived as a lonely drifter with no particular destination or purpose. He was leaving as someone who had made a real difference in the world. The desert stretched out before him, vast and full of possibilities. Jacob didn't know where his wandering would take him next, but he felt more hopeful about the future than he had in years. There were still good people in the world, still causes worth fighting for, still reasons to believe that justice could prevail over corruption and hatred. He touched the Apache medicine pouch that now hung from his saddle, a reminder of the lives he had saved and the evil he had helped expose. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Jacob felt ready to face them with renewed purpose and determination. The sun was rising higher in the desert sky, painting the landscape in brilliant colors of gold and red. Jacob urged his horse forward toward the horizon, wondering what new adventures and opportunities to do good might be waiting for him in the vast territories ahead. 3 months after leaving Copper Ridge, Jacob found himself in the bustling town of Silver Creek, where news traveled fast among the mining camps and trading posts. He was surprised to learn that the Morrison trial had become famous throughout the territory, not just for the crimes themselves, but for how an unknown drifter had uncovered the conspiracy and saved 3 innocent lives. You're something of a legend around these parts, the Silver Creek newspaper editor told him when they met by chance in the hotel restaurant. That story's been reprinted in newspapers from California to Texas. Folks are calling you the Desert Angel. Jacob laughed at the dramatic nickname. I'm just a man who happened to be in the right place at the right time. Maybe so, but you've inspired a lot of people. There's been a whole movement of citizens standing up to corruption in their own towns, citing your example in Copper Ridge. This news pleased Jacob more than any personal praise could have. If his actions had encouraged others to fight for justice in their own communities, then the good he had done was multiplying far beyond what he had imagined during his stay in Silver Creek. Jacob received a letter forwarded from Copper Ridge. It was from Marshal Thompson, updating him on recent developments. Morrison had indeed been convicted on all charges and sentenced to 20 years in territorial prison. Sheriff Hawkins received 5 years, while Deputy Collins got 2 years for his cooperation with the investigation. The new sheriff appointed to Copper Ridge was a former Army officer with an impeccable reputation. More importantly, the Apache tribe had sent formal representatives to negotiate a peace treaty with the territorial government. The unjust treatment of the 3 women had brought attention to the broader issues between Native Americans and white settlers, leading to more honest dialogue and mutual understanding. The women you saved have become powerful voices for peace in their community, Thompson had written. Ayana in particular has learned to speak English fluently and serves as a translator and negotiator. She credits you with showing her that some white men can be trusted to do the right thing. Jacob was deeply moved to learn about Ayana's new role. The young woman who had faced death with such courage was now helping to build bridges between 2 communities that had too often seen each other as enemies. The letter also contained news that made Jacob smile. Dr. Harrison had married Mrs. Chun, the boarding house owner, and they were planning to establish a medical clinic that would serve both white settlers and Apache people. Their marriage had surprised the town, but their commitment to helping everyone regardless of race had earned them widespread respect. As Jacob continued his travels through the southwest, he found that the story of Copper Ridge had preceded him. In saloons and general stores, around campfires and at trading posts, people recognized his name and wanted to hear the true version of what had happened. Some of the stories that had grown up around the events were wildly exaggerated. In one version, Jacob had single-handedly fought off 20 of Morrison's men. In another, he had tracked the stolen cattle by following their hoofprints across 100 miles of desert. Jacob always corrected these tall tales, emphasizing that the real heroes were the townspeople who had stood up for justice once they learned the truth. The important thing isn't what I did, he would tell people. It's what ordinary folks like you can do when you refuse to let innocent people suffer for other men's crimes. 6 months after Copper Ridge, Jacob was traveling through Apache territory when he encountered a group of young Apache warriors. For a moment, tension filled the air as both sides prepared for possible conflict. Then Jacob remembered the medicine pouch that Ayana had given him when he showed the pouch to the Apache warriors. Their attitudes changed immediately. The leader of the group, a man named Nanton, spoke enough English to communicate with Jacob. "You are the one who saved our cousins from the hanging rope," Nanton said with respect. "Ayana told us we might meet you someday. You are welcome to travel safely through our lands." The warriors not only allowed Jacob to pass, but invited him to share their camp for the night. Around the fire, they told him more about how the events at Copper Ridge had affected their people. "For many years, our young men wanted to make war against all white settlers," Nanton explained. "They said white men could never be trusted, that they would always choose lies over truth. But you showed us that some white men will risk their lives to protect justice. Even for Apache people, they do not know." Jacob learned that Ayana had become a respected leader among her people, advocating for peaceful solutions to conflicts with white settlers. Her experience of being saved by a white stranger had given her credibility. When she argued that cooperation was possible, she says the future belongs to those who can see past the color of a man's skin to the goodness or evil in his heart, Nanton continued. "Your actions proved that such men exist." As Jacob sat by the Apache fire, listening to their stories and sharing his own, he realized how profoundly the events at Copper Ridge had changed him. He had started that adventure as a lonely drifter trying to avoid human connection. Now he understood that his wandering had a purpose beyond his own healing. He was meant to be a bridge between different communities, someone who could move freely through the territory and help resolve conflicts before they turned violent. His outsider status, which had once felt like a burden, was actually his greatest asset in this role. The Apache warriors gave Jacob detailed information about the trails and water sources throughout their territory, as well as warnings about areas where tensions with white settlers remained high. They also told him about other injustices they had witnessed, situations where someone like him might be able to help. When Jacob finally rode away from the Apache camp, he carried with him a new understanding of his place in the world. He was no longer just a drifter running from his past. He was a force for justice in a harsh land where good men were often too few and too scattered to make a difference alone. The desert that had once seemed empty and purposeless now felt full of possibilities. Somewhere ahead, there were probably other innocent people facing false accusations, other corrupt officials abusing their power, other communities torn apart by misunderstanding and hatred. Jacob touched the Apache medicine pouch once more and smiled. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them with the knowledge that one person, in the right place at the right time, could change everything. The desert had made him strong, but Copper Ridge had given him purpose. As the sun set behind him, painting the sky in brilliant reds and purples, Jacob rode toward his uncertain but meaningful future, ready to answer whatever call to justice might be waiting just beyond the horizon.